persons who have been tasked to investigate to come forward and say, well, this is where we are. And I think as public servants, as persons who are accountable to the public, they should account for what is going on.
Lastly from me on the impacts investigation and on the impacts report, in case you just joined us, Mr. Giovanni and James is on with us again this morning. We're continuing on the new course, the discourse, focusing on national security matters, citizen safety matters as well, public safety. Giovanni James is a former citizen security advisor to the government of St. Lucia. What you just described for the officers who appear to have been exonerated after almost a decade, and the missed opportunities that they would have had, since still that there is no clearance for them in the public domain, no exoneration, so to speak, in the public domain, plus the unofficial 3 who still may be implicated here 10 years after, still no closure and no clear path to justice. Do you expect or anticipate any not a legal challenge, but any legal procedure to be taken against the state by those officers? Any likelihood of that?
It is possible, Shannon. I mean, if I have been pushed to simply give some guidance in relation to whether there's any legal recourse, I can anticipate that some officers may actually be contemplating. If not, they may have actually started proceedings. But I'm not in a position to say definitively that yes, proceedings have started, but it is a possibility.
Thanks for that update. Let's move on to other matters related to crime and national security here on the island. The discussion has been a very lively one, and people have said in clear terms that crime is a lot more attractive than the proposed social programs by governments. So you have a lot of more youngsters being attracted and gravitating towards criminal gangs and criminal activities, as opposed to engagement in the social programs and other initiatives that are available to them. How can we start to take away some of the incentives from the gangs, crack down on the profits, so that it is not as it does not come across to be more profitable or beneficial than association with a social incentive program?
Shannon, proceeds of crime legislation, money laundering legislation, that is key. And it goes way back. It has been used around the world. I would like viewers, and perhaps you, Shannon, to perhaps look at what is happening in Jamaica in terms of the use of proceeds of crime legislation, unexplained wealth orders being granted, civil recovery orders. It is as simple as, Shannon, I'll give you an example. Someone is found with a large amount of cash and cannot give an explanation as to how they came about this cash. There have been many instances, I can tell you, where in St. Lucia, millions has been forfeited in terms of cash forfeitures, and that money has been reinvested into crime fighting initiatives. And so if we want to dissuade persons from committing crimes, we need to effectively use this legislation. Why is it that someone who doesn't seem to have a job is able to drive a luxury vehicle, have a big house on the hill, and there is nobody asking the question or investigating and saying, why is this person in possession of this? If we can take away those proceeds, if we can take away the assets from the individuals, then it is going to be dissuasive in nature, because the young man coming up is going to say, well, what am I going to benefit from this? I put my life at risk every day. And the government can simply come and say, well, you've not been able to show how you were able to amass this wealth. We're going to take it away. It is going to dissuade persons from getting involved in crime. It is going to make legitimate jobs more attractive. In Jamaica, they use unexplained wealth orders all the time.
Two things on the proceeds of crime legislation. Quickly, Mr. James, do we have the willpower to we have the legislation, but do we have the willpower to enforce the legislation? Because what you're talking about, the proceeds of crime, it's not just on the ground, it's not just with the unemployed, perhaps it's across all sectors of our society. So firstly, do we have the willpower as a nation to enforce such legislation?
I think with the current legislation that we have, there is the willpower, Shannon, but I can tell you that when I worked with the regional security system, one of the things that we were instrumental in doing was drafting proceeds of, basically model proceeds of crime legislation for the entire Caribbean. And one of the things that we would have suggested was the introduction of civil recovery orders, which, as I explained, unexplained wealth orders, where you use the civil standard. It is not even a criminal trial. You are going against the assets of the individual, and it doesn't matter who this person is. It can be somebody at the upper echelons of society who just cannot explain how he or she came by this wealth. We can forfeit. However, unfortunately, this legislation or this amendment has not been passed, and so it is a missed opportunity for the government and people of St. Lucia in terms of making crime less attractive.
So that piece of legislation is drafted but just not passed.
That is correct.
And again, it goes back to it goes back to my earlier question. I'm not pressing you too much, Mr. James, but perhaps it's not passed because we don't have the willpower to enforce such legislation, and because of perhaps the implications that it will have across the board for it to be implemented. Not pressing you too much, but perhaps that's the reason why it still remains just in draft.
Shannon, I will qualify what I've said. I think there's willpower in the sense of the investigative arms who would be responsible for doing the investigation and prosecuting.
Absolutely.
However, these things always raise political questions, if I can say, where most governments, unfortunately, and it's not a problem simply in St. Lucia, but I want to speak of other jurisdictions as well in saying that when this legislation or this amendment or model legislation was presented, one question that came up quite frequently is, how do we justify simply just going and taking assets from individuals? What is the implication going to be? And of course, there's always a tie to, well, this is going to affect me in an election. And so governments, successive governments across the region have been reluctant to introduce this legislation, even when there is international pressure to do so. But what I will say, Shannon, is that there will come a time where countries will have no option
choice
but to pass the legislation as a result of the mutual evaluations that take place on a regular basis.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, and it's I guess a wait and see until we get to that point, because not just with that legislation which remains in draft, we've instituted so many laws here, but sadly they're not being enforced. On this occasion, you see clearly, viewers, why perhaps this particular piece of legislation remains in draft format. Speak to the examples that you have seen across the region and internationally as well, how the proceeds from crime which have been seized under such legislation can assist law enforcement in the efforts in protecting the wider society.
Yeah, Shannon, I'll give you the example of Jamaica. The FID in Jamaica has been successful in seizing millions and millions worth of assets from persons involved in Ponzi schemes, persons involved in lottery scamming. Okay, because that lottery scamming, for example, in Jamaica is quite a big thing. And just to explain what lottery scamming is, I'm not talking about go playing lottery, but persons being able to acquire telephone numbers of individuals in the United States and other parts of the world, and they scam these individuals into paying a fee because these individuals are told that they've won something. And that was causing quite a bit of violence in Jamaica, in certain parts of Jamaica, because the information, Shannon, was so critical that persons were willing to kill and die just to get that information, because it is like a treasure trove. But what started happening is that the government realized that there were just too many individuals involved in this, and persons were becoming rich of lottery scamming. And so what they decided to do was to use money laundering legislation, but more so proceeds of crime legislation, because in many instances they were not able to get sufficient evidence to prove those persons, or to even charge those persons and prove them guilty in a criminal court. However, this legislation allows you to go deal with the matter as if it were a civil case and say, well, okay, what job have you done? What taxes have you paid? Okay, how did you acquire all of these assets? And if you are not in a position to be able to explain, then there is the rebuttable presumption that these assets came from crime. And it's as simple as that. And it has worked wonders in Jamaica. You have examples of, I can tell you, in St. Vincent, one of the first cases dealing with proceeds of crime, this guy frequented St. Lucia actually quite often. He had yachts, he had big houses, he had vehicles, and the funny thing is that every vehicle of his was 666, so P666. So he portrayed himself as the Don in St. Vincent. And one of my colleagues who worked with me at the RSS, who often gave presentations on this case, said that he engages with the youth quite frequently, and many of them would say to him, I want to be like this guy. But when that guy was arrested and charged and all his assets were seized, they started to say, you know what, on second thought, I don't want to be like this guy, because he's done all of that and he's lost everything. For what? And so that was the dissuasive nature in it. And these are just two examples. You have it taking place in the Cayman Islands, in the British Overseas Territories, in Dominica. There is proceeds of crime legislation. But what I want to say, Shannon, is that perhaps what we need to see happening in St. Lucia is that there is more publicity in terms of the successes of our law enforcement authorities. Because I can say to you that in relation to cash forfeiture in the OECS and even Barbados, St. Lucia is the leader.
Interesting.
We have an excellent team of investigators who've been able to forfeit millions. Okay, and those funds have gone towards the purchase of vehicles, because the intention is to use those proceeds and put it back
into law enforcement,
and other crime fighting initiatives.
I think you're absolutely correct in saying there is need for greater publicity of those gains, because you pointed to the example in Jamaica, where when the youngsters got wind of, well, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I think it was, got wind of how the proceeds were seized from that guy who used the 666. They no longer wanted to be like him. So if the stories of those successes locally, where you see in St. Lucia perhaps has the highest levels of forfeiture in the Eastern Caribbean, and Barbados as well, are told, perhaps it can have some impact in guiding our youngsters away from wanting to be associated with criminal gangs.
But Shannon, I want to add something to that, because there must be a balance. If we are going to take away the incentives for persons to commit crime, we must provide alternatives. You cannot take away, it's like they say, you take my bread, so what do I eat? And so it requires us, and I hope I'm not deviating from where you want to go.
Oh, no, I'm very much interested in finding out what you think would be an appropriate alternative.
Yes. It requires state agencies to not come up with social programs that are short-lived in nature, but would give individuals an opportunity to become business owners, entrepreneurs in their own right. And I want to give the example of St. Kitts and Nevis, one of the jurisdictions that I had the fortune of working in. And I can tell you that crime at one time, St. Kitts and Nevis was considered to have the highest homicide rate per capita in the world. It was that high for its population. And what happened is that the government saw the need to invest resources, and that is what we need to see happening in St. Lucia if we want to make any meaningful strides in terms of tackling crime. So the government hired experts to guide its decision-making process, in terms of how to deal with gun crime in St. Kitts. They came about with social programs, and I can tell you, if you are to look at the statistics now, as it relates to homicides in St. Kitts, it is a lot lower, far lower than what it was before, because they decided to create programs to give people employment. And the way it was done, it may not seem to be a positive move for many, but the way it was done is that the gang leaders were targeted, the heads of the gangs were targeted, and they were told, listen, we need this to stop, and we are willing to provide alternatives. We will help you set up legitimate businesses where your guys can be involved in those businesses, they can work. So things like carpentry, construction, car wash, there are so many different things that one can do, entrepreneurship programs that we can engage our youth in, that will see benefits. Now, some may say that the young men now don't want to work, and that may be true. But we are not talking about simply coming up with social programs and not looking at the other aspects. It has to be multifaceted.
And the thing is, you're given an option as well. So I have the social program, and we're just using the example of Viewfort here. I have a social program, but in addition to the social program, I'm going into the Mango, I'm going into this hotspot in Viewfort, engaging the leaders and saying, hey, I will give you the support to open legitimate and honest business. That's where you're going.
That is pretty much what happened in St. Kitts, and it was able to quell the violence that was happening in St. Kitts.
Yeah.
The government invested in the people, because Shannon, yesterday I said that we need to go and look at the root causes of what is pushing crime in St. Lucia. The unfortunate thing, and I'm not political, I'm not partisan, that is not my concern, but I've had the opportunity to speak to various persons, and when you hear persons telling you that they don't know where they're going to get the next meal, when you have a father who has children and the mother is saying, well, where are we getting food? The children are hungry. This man not being able to work is going to turn to crime. And it is simply a survival instinct. And the unfortunate thing about crime, Shannon, is that he may start out as a petty thief, or he may rob, and he graduates to something bigger. And so unless we deal with programs where we don't just give people handouts, which they only have use of it for a day or two, we give them a cylinder of gas, we pay their electricity for 1 month, that is not going to resolve the issue.
It is not. Agreed. And one of the only things which opposers of the former Prime Minister in St. Kitts used at the time against his strategy was the fact that when you go in these communities and do the engagement and provide the alternative opportunities for legitimate business, there should be genuine effort to retrieve the firearms as well and the illegal devices.
Indeed, indeed, because what it does, Shannon, it creates a buffer to allow, if the guys are not busy shooting each other, it gives the police the opportunity to focus their attention in terms of recoveries. Okay, as opposed to constantly investigating. And that is what is happening in St. Lucia. The police are always trying to catch up. Because every other day, if you have, for example, you have a major crime unit that is responsible in St. Lucia for investigating all murders in St. Lucia. Okay? And they are pretty much burnt out. When you have a group of maybe 6 or 7 individuals investigating all of those serious crimes, and they investigate murders, they investigate other serious crimes, where are we going? So there must be a clear plan, there must be a clear policy. Okay, the police either need to say, well, okay, we are going to focus on preventative policing, and you throw your resources behind that, or the crimes happen and they investigate. Now, from experience, one can see that a lot of the crimes are not being solved because you don't have witnesses. But we need to come up with various social programs. We need to empower our youth. We need to provide alternatives to them. And I think on the first occasion when I was on your show, I spoke about things like information technology, okay, programming. I spoke about, my son telling me he wants to start a YouTube channel because this is where the money is. That is where we need to be going. And we need to get persons who can guide the decision-making process, okay, because we are not operating back in the 80s where policing is the same. Okay, things have changed. Okay, we have a population right now where people are no longer turned off by violent scenes. So we need to provide the right alternatives, and sometimes the best way to do that, Shannon, is to engage those who are affected. And that is why I think there is need for an in-depth study, okay, of what are the root causes of crime in St. Lucia. Not let's sit at,
I think we'd have lost connection with Giovanni. We will have to re-establish connection with him. Still with us here, St. Lucia. Very interesting discussion. Attorney at law Giovanni James. He is also a consultant on security matters as well, and a former national advisor on citizen security and citizen safety here to the government of St. Lucia. We will re-establish connection with him in just a bit. Stay with us. It's a very interesting discussion. We're talking all issues of national security. Mr. James, you're back with us. Giovanni, you're back with us. Good morning. My producers are telling me that he is on.
Yes, I am.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Disconnected.
Thanks for coming back on. Giovanni, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I don't know if you would have concluded your point or you want to continue. I have another follow-up question for you.
I don't know what you last heard, so perhaps we can move on to another question.
So just one more from me on the proposed proceeds of crime legislation. Make the case for me for it to be enforced as a civil matter as opposed to a criminal matter. What are the benefits there?
The benefits of it being civil in nature is the burden of proof is on the state, the standard is less. Whereas in a criminal matter, you have to prove beyond reasonable doubt, Shannon. And that is a very high standard. With it being a civil case, the burden is less. You are not going against the individual, you are going against the assets. And it is for the individual to prove to the police. So the easiest way to explain it to your viewing public and your listening public is to speak about cash, and the same concept can apply to property. In one instance, I remember 265,000 euros being found in the possession of an individual. You don't know where it came from, but the mere fact of its packaging, how it was packaged, okay, it was on a boat. The police were able to say, well, the circumstances are such that this money could only have come from crime, and it was linked to the drug trade, despite the fact that no drugs were found. Because the individual in question was not able to explain how he came by it. And this money was forfeited. And it was as easy as that. And you've had many instances in St. Lucia where you have foreign currency and you even have local currency. When a financial investigation is conducted, it is a very detailed investigation looking at the individual, their employment background, their financial status, their banking status, their tax status, and saying, well, this person has never paid taxes, his bank account does not reflect regular monies going in and out of his account. We look at his employment background, okay, he doesn't seem to make much, if at all anything. And so on that basis, we are saying that this money came from crime or was intended for use in crime. In relation to property, as has been the case in Jamaica, they go with the civil standard and say, when we carry out this financial investigation, this person cannot legitimize the assets that he or she has. And so the logical conclusion is that it came from crime. Now, a lot of people will not be in favor of it, Shannon. I can tell you it has met a lot of resistance. But the aim of it is that it seeks to identify those persons who acquires property, okay, through illegal means, and persons who are able to amass wealth through legitimate means will have the necessary paper trail to do so. So I give an example of, should an individual be allowed to walk into a car dealership with $200,000 cash